Welcome to this latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story. I'm the president of Dale Carnegie Tokyo Training. My special guest today is an old friend of mine, Bill Hall, who is the president of Ipsos Healthcare Japan Ltd.
Correct.
Okay, I got that right. That's great. Okay, Bill. So, we've known each other for a long, long time, and you've had many different roles, leadership roles in Japan. Also run your own business over the years. But let's go back and just sort of pick up, how is it that you came to Japan, and what are the sort of roles you've had over the years in leadership?
How many hours do we have?
We've got plenty of hours, don't worry.
Okay. So, I first came to Japan in 1969 on a scholarship, having majored in Japanese and economics at Sydney University. And I was at Stotsubashi University right at the time of the student riots. If you remember, you're probably too young to remember that. But
68, 69.
Yeah. And so
I read about it in my textbooks at university.
Right. So at that point, all the universities were shut. So I arrived and the universities were all shut. So I went out there and there's nobody there, no classes, no nothing. So I decided, my Japanese language at that point was very good and written because but we didn't have language laboratories in those days, right? And our professors believed that anything more modern than the 16th century was not academic. So in my final honors year of Japanese, I spent a year as the only student reading 8th century Japanese poetry in the original, like Manyoshu, Taketori Monogatari, and all these famous old Japanese books. So then I decided I'd just go out and travel around Japan. And in those days, with course no money as a student, we did the donko. You remember the donko, the old trains that used to go overnight and you get to the next town. So you sleep on the train, which just cost you nothing for the night, get off and then go somewhere, meet people, talk to them. And so I traveled all over Japan, all the way out to Amami Oshima, across to Tsushima, up to Hokkaido. They did everything. So by the time I came back, I was speaking pretty good Japanese, right? About three or 4 months later. And my professor started to get worried what had happened to me, but anyway. So then I went back to Australia. I got a scholarship to go to the University of Western Australia, where I helped establish the Japanese Studies Department, but in the Faculty of Economics. This was the first one in the world. The idea was that we would not go through what I had just been through, which is reading 8th century Japanese in the poetry and original. When you go out and look for a job, people look at you and say, well, come back when you've got something a little bit more commercial to talk about. And so we started that off and it went very well. And all the young students that came out of that have moved up through the world and, be president of this in Japan, president of that in Japan, US Embassy, not US, Australian Embassy, all sorts of different people. You know many of them over the years. And so then I came back to it. So once you get one scholarship, they think you're a genius, so they give you another one and another one and another one. So I came back to Japan a few times. And then I left Japan. I left there in 1972, 73. In between, I'd done a little bit of consulting with some companies. And then joined a company called INRA, International Market Research Associates, was there for a couple of years. Then I moved to a company called FNCC, Fuji National City Consulting, which was a joint venture between Fuji Bank in those days and First National City, which is now Citibank. And this was the first hands across the water consulting company between Japan and the US. And we had some pretty heavy people on the board, Iwasa from Fuji Bank and Walt Wriston, who was the chairman of Citibank, on the board. And we did some pretty neat, interesting projects, which I can't talk too much about, as always in this business. And then a bit later, then I moved across to ASI with George Fields and I. And we built that up as the #1 market research company, at least dealing with foreign businesses in those days. And I was there for about 7 or 8 years, and we then decided to sell the company, which we did, made a few shillings. I then moved to become president of Sterling Winthrop, which was a pharmaceutical company, and ran that for about 5 years.
You made the transition from having your own marketing consultancy to going into pharma as a president of a company. That's a pretty big difference between the...
Well, yes and no, in the sense that one of the businesses that we established inside ASI was in healthcare business.
Oh, okay.
So we had a pretty good track record,
right,
and worked with a lot of these companies. And particularly in those days, and people who could speak Japanese and knew healthcare was pretty limited. And so they made me an offer, and I sort of accepted it.
So is this your first real occasion to actually be leading a team? Because you'd been probably an operator in many of those consulting roles, and now you've actually got a whole company to run.
Well, I've always been number two. Well, I was number two in each of those earlier roles.
Right.
So senior vice president, whatever you want to call it. So you're running a fair bit of the business, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But then running, moving, the change really was more moving into big corporate as opposed to smaller companies is probably the difference, right? And, I had to learn, that in America you can't say this, you can't say that, all those sort of things that Americans love to talk about. So we had, trainings about this and that, whatever, which we didn't used to have to do in Japan because it was... So I ran that for about 5 years, did some pretty interesting stuff.
How big was the firm? How many people were working on it?
It was still fairly small because we had mainly out-licensed a lot of the stuff and had done some deals, and I'll come back to that in a minute, with the out-licensing. And then suddenly out of left field, Kodak came and bought Sterling Winthrop.
Oh.
Right? Which most people don't really understand why or how that would happen. And I'll come back to then the people situation, right? So the scenario then was that people always forget Kodak was a chemical company, right? Had something like 500,000 compounds on which they had patents, none of which had ever been tested for pharmacological efficacy. So that's a lot of compounds, So you hit 1 or 2 products, you could have a nice potential business. They also have a lot of knowledge around film nanotechnology because, they're making film, a lot of nano stuff and that, which is also a very important part of healthcare. So there was a logic to that. Then the other concept was, okay, and they could see digital was coming, which would kill off a lot of their potential business. So where would you take your business to, right? Particularly with a brand name like Kodak, right? So, and at that point, there was maybe the 3 most profitable businesses in the world were healthcare, pharmaceuticals, tobacco, and Kodak at that point. Right? You couldn't take Kodak brand into tobacco, right? But healthcare made a lot of logical sense. Right? And so that's what they did, and then didn't do it as well as they should have done. Fuji, by the way, has copied exactly that scenario, and now in Japan is doing quite well, and the healthcare business is growing. Their facial skincare business is growing because they had the nanotechnology to use in that. So the strategy was correct. It was just not executed very well. So after they did that, then they decided they'd exit from this business. Then made me an offer, would I join the real Kodak as opposed to the healthcare business. And I sort of turned them down a few times, but they finally said, we really need you to do. So I accepted the offer. Because they really had no idea what they were doing very well in Japan. I mean, to give you an example, you know Naite, where the students are guaranteed a position from April 1, right? But it's not a legal contract in Japan. So some smart lawyer figured out, okay, it's not a legal contract. So the day before this was due to happen, they cancelled all this, right? Which created quite a stir in newspapers, Yankee go home, sort of stuff, right? So I had to come in and then clean up a lot of that mess. Also, we had a scenario where, if you remember the old days, you had DP, you'd put your film in and it would go out to a wholesale lab, and then it would come back a day or two later, right? On-site labs were happening, so all of this old-style business had to be shut down and closed down, right? So then they asked me, would you like a package? I said, thank you very much. So I left. And then I joined a company called Ipsos, which Ipsos was a medical market research company, the last independent company in the healthcare market research, which is rather specialized compared to consumer research. An old mate of mine who was the chairman, he said, well, Bill, we could never make it in Japan. What about? So I bought in a few shares, and then the plan was we'd build it up, sell it off, and or do an IPO. And we built it up, and we sold it off to Synovate, which bought it, and then that expanded their healthcare division. And then Synovate later on then got bought by Ipsos, and so I'm now with Ipsos.
So as part of the sale provision that you had to stay on
Yes.
to keep the business going.
Yeah.
Right. And so if we think about Ipsos now has been how long? Is that formation?
Ipsos started 1975, so it's almost 50 years old, right?
Wow,
it's in France. No, not in Japan. They started in France and grew in Europe first. And then it grew more or less then by acquisition, right? In, first of all, Latin America and then in Asia, and bought into Japan 2 or 3 companies in Japan over the years.
So how long have you been with Ipsos now?
With Ipsos, Ipsos purchased Synovate in 2011, 2012. So that's about 10 years.
Okay, about 10 years now. Mm-hmm. So if we think back to your early leadership experiences, what were, we think about probably, be it the smaller companies where you were number 2, you're leading a section or you're leading a team or whatever, or when you got into the more corporate side, what were some things you found were challenging to lead in Japan at that time?
Everything's challenging to lead, right?
Everything is challenging.
Everything is challenging.
What was particularly challenging?
Well, obviously, getting rid of a very large number of people is probably the biggest challenge, right?
This is when you were with Kodak, you mean?
Kodak, yeah.
Okay.
That's probably the biggest. And the staff knew it had to happen, right? And I was sort of brought in from outside, and parachuted in, which made everybody very nervous, right? And they clearly knew something was going to have to happen. So I was running what's called Kodak Imagica, which was that sort of wholesale side of the business, right? And we had a few shops and trucks and things like that. So first of all, I decided I should wear the little uniform. So all the people working in the labs wore this little yellow coat, right? Nobody in the main Kodak wore anything like this coat. They just wore suits. So I wore the little coat. I had to get one big enough to fit me, took a while. And I used to wear that every day. So that made me a bit more of one of the the team. Then they said, we know you want to get rid of a lot of people because we know it has to happen. And so we managed to get what it was considered as a sunset industry with MITI, right? Because it was clearly going out of, as a business, as a sunset business. And so I said to him, okay, I know nothing about this business, so why don't you get together with the team and figure out what we should do? And so they spent, I don't know, a week or so. I'll come back when you're ready, So came back, a room about this big, not quite as big as this. Whole wall was plastered with this moving here, this moving here, this moving here, this moving. And that was up to getting rid of X number of bodies, quite a large number. But I said, that's really great, but not enough. And so they went back at it again. So basically, I let them do it.
Who's them in this case? The leadership group or
the Japanese team?
Japanese team itself.
Yeah, the Japanese team who were then in charge of all the labs all over Japan. Because we basically had to close them down, and but you still had to be able to service customers, right? And they know better about the business than anybody else, right? So I let them do it.
Well, apart from having to close down the entire company, apart from that challenge, I'm thinking more in terms of when your early experiences of leadership, when you first started leading teams here, because you hadn't really had a leadership background prior to that. You'd been in the academic world, you'd been up here studying, and now you're consulting, but now you're actually working in companies where you actually got to supervise people, I presume. What did you find challenging about that initially?
Well, don't forget that even consulting companies have teams.
Yeah, that's my point. So what did you find challenging when you were in those consulting firms as a leader?
Well, if we go to ASI, we had to build people, right? And that's the hardest part, is getting competent people. I mean, it's not everything is team. You have to have a team, right? You just can't run a business without a team. And the hardest part, particularly in smaller companies, was convincing anyone that you're going to be around long enough, particularly in those days, right, if you're a foreign company, right? Because, people come in, they leave, and the image of foreigners in Japan, particularly in those days, was not that good in terms of business practices, right? So that's probably the toughest challenge, right, is to get people to join and to stay.
How did you do that? How did you convince them to join, and how did you convince them to stay?
Well, staying was not such a problem once they got in. What my philosophy was that, particularly in those days, let's say in ASI, was if you're a foreigner, you'd have to speak Japanese, and if you're Japanese, you should at least have some English capability, but it doesn't have to be huge, right? So basically what I've done over the other problem is, nobody teaches, there's no market research courses in Japan or in Japanese universities. So there's no profession of market research as such.
Still?
A little bit, but not really as a profession. I mean, if you go to America, there's a profession of market research. In Europe, the same, particularly in England, not in Japan. So if you think about it, if you're a boy growing up, you want to be a firefighter or a pilot or an engine driver. No one ever thinks about growing up to be a market researcher, right? It just doesn't occur to most people, right? And so most of the people who join the industry tend to be by accident to some extent. So what would happen, with particular notes that we should do personal interviews much more, not so much internet before that day, before internet. So we would have students who would join us to do interviews, and they'd like it. They learned something and they found this quite interesting. So that would be one way of recruiting. The other is, I found a couple of really good foreign people whose Japanese was good. I mean, one person, he came in for an interview. I always have to take a gamble whether this person's going to make it. He had a really good American, 3.9 average from the university, which is a good score in those days. And he'd been translating Buddhist texts at some weirdo temple somewhere, came in wearing his hair down to here and thongs and, baggy trousers. And I said to George, I think he might make it. But anyway, we took a gamble and it worked out very well. He became quite a famous researcher himself now. I won't mention names.
Okay.
So always take a bit of a gamble has been one of the ways to get people who have what I feel is sort of some of the basics, whatever the basics may be, and we can always add to that. Right? Very difficult to find a fully developed person, right?
And what about after, the sort of early consulting, Kodak, then you go into the sort of, again, healthcare area consulting. Yeah. In those companies, when you were leading those companies, what did you find was effective in getting people engaged around their work? Because this has become quite a big thing, measuring engagement scores, making sure people are feeling, good about the company, particularly now in terms of retaining people. What things have you found over the years you've said, this is a good way to engage people in their work?
Well, I think, one of your points about engagement score is incorrect. That's the wrong question. The premise is completely wrong. Right? You need to look at how people use scales. Right? I'll give you a short definition if you want. I have papers on it. Look, I can send you it. Right? This is a question I get asked a lot by presidents, right, and people. We know our business is going well. We know our people are working well and engaged, but the score is very low compared to Asia Pacific or compared to America or wherever else. Right? And they keep getting hammered by head office. It's completely wrong. Right? It's to do with the way scales are used by Japanese. So if I try to simplify it for you, so Americans, if let's say a 1 to 10 scale, Americans start at 10 and work towards the middle, or start at 1 and work towards the middle. The Japanese start in the middle, 4 or 5. And then if it's good, they'll inch up slightly to 6, maybe 7. Very rarely will you get 9 or 10. Right? And also very rarely do you get much on the negative side. Right? So it's a completely different. So the problem then is when you look at the Japanese score of average of 7 or something like that for the Japan business, and Americans of 9.5, and the English are 9.2. The Germans and the Swiss are somewhat a little bit lower. Chinese are on the high side. So it depends on the country and the culture. So the question the advice we give, which I give to people now is, okay, you can't really compare across countries with that if you want to compare across and say you're much lower. You have to compare versus last year, right? Because if they're working on the different scale, then the only comparison is, now there's 2 ways. One is the best comparison is from this year versus last year. Have you improved or not improved? Right? The other way is there are ways of weighting the scale which we do with international studies, where if you're running America, Japan, 5E or 4EU, or whatever it is now, England, then we have weights which we can't publicize, obviously, but we have weightings based on thousands and thousands of projects which we know work. So that's the key. That's the key point. So it's not that the Japanese are not engaged. They may be engaged, but you're just reading the scales wrong, right?
Well, they talk about the 30% Japan factor for luxury goods, because when they do the post-purchase surveys of retail customers who are buying luxury goods, they find the numbers are very low, as you say, compared to other countries where people are buying similar goods, to the point where they've identified a 30% differential that they have to, whatever the Japanese number is, they have to add 30% onto it to make it somehow similar, to scope it with the rest of the world. So, yeah, I believe that too. And also, in my experience, there's only a couple of questions in those surveys that really ask about engagement, but they're not really suitable for Japan. One of them is, would you recommend your workplace to your friends and family as a place to work? And I always thought, well, that's a really dumb question to ask Japanese, because they're absolutely never going to take any accountability or any responsibility either way, that their family or friends don't like it or the company doesn't like them. So the answer to that's going to get a low score. And there's other, I just can't remember what it is, but equally not really pertinent for Japan. So I always thought, like you said, these scores just, they're not reflecting anything. So if we forget about the scoring, but just think about the practicality, what things did you find as a leader help you to help the team become more engaged about their work?
Well, my experience is that they've been pretty engaged.
You felt they were already engaged.
I mean, I don't know how engaged, but I mean, it's not that they're not engaged, right? I mean, if the Japanese are working for you and they've joined and they're working hard, they're engaged, right? I don't know whether, Now, I think one of the problems that comes up with Western companies in particular is that when you first started in Japan, you're a small company. I'm talking the global corporates, right? And over the, let's say, 10 or 20 years, you've grown into a much bigger company. Your problem then becomes, okay, some of the people who you could attract 20 years ago because you were tiny may no longer be the people you really need to take you to the next level. So it's not necessarily engagement. I mean, the older team is engaged, but they may not be the engaged type that you want anymore. I mean, that is probably more of the issue that companies that are growing in Japan face, right? Now, your problem then is, okay, you can't say, okay, sorry, we no longer need you because, we've outgrown you. Because without these people and all the work they've done over the years, you wouldn't be where you are today. So that's one of the things you have to balance, right? And gradually, adjust the types of people, change the structure a little bit and so on. I think that's probably more of an issue. Because, and the other side is, some of those older ones become less engaged because they're no longer quite so useful in the modern type of direction we want to go. So there may be some lack of engagement there. The younger ones, though, I find are very much engaged.
One of the criteria, I believe, for innovation is feeling engaged about your work, interested in your work, wanting it to be done better, or finding a way for the company to do things better. So given that you feel that they are engaged, what did you find worked well to get people to come up with creative ideas, innovative ideas?
Well, once again, how do you define innovation? mean, we have a whole division in Ipsos globally that does nothing but innovation forecasting, testing.
I'm not so much thinking about R&D type of innovation, which, as you say, these are scientists or technicians or quants or this type of thing that's their work. I'm talking about just within the normal frame of a work reference, that people are thinking about how to do things better, how can we be more efficient, how can we be faster, how can we save things, that type of general idea of making things better, I suppose. Build a better mousetrap type of thinking.
Well, we I mean, in the company I'm with now, we do that. So we have goals that are set for PMP. We set at the beginning of the year, which we both agree upon, each individual employee, and the goals have to be measurable. So not just, I'm going to do something. It says I'm going to, for example, what's a good example without saying too much? For example, when we do field work, we interview doctors. That all goes into computers and everything else. So if we could find a way to reduce the time by X%, or reduce the length of a questionnaire by 5 minutes. So they're very concrete level of practicality, and they're measured at the end of the year. Well, usually we do 6-month review then at the end of the year, because the world is changing so quickly. But that's how we would do it. And so, but you have to agree in advance, set it at the beginning of the year.
So what you're doing basically is you're breaking down the tasks and looking for improvements, like sort of Kaizen-style improvements, and it's sort of like one by one with each individual?
Yes, each individual.
Right, one by one, right.
Yeah,
okay.
Each individual has to work with their immediate boss above them, right? And then I'll review everyone before it's signed off, right?
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. So this is all documented, and then it's
documented, measured,
reviewed, and
reviewed,
then you're rewarded accordingly based on how you've performed.
Yeah.
Right, so it's quite a thorough way of doing things.
It's very thorough. Yeah.
What about trust? Japan is certainly a trust-based society. I mean, every society, I think, is trust-based, but this society, for me in particular, it's got a strong requirement for trust, and there are ways to build trust in organisations. What have you found works well to build trust in organisations amongst people?
Well, I tend to, believe that it's a team effort. So, and you can't talk to everybody because you have bodies, so many bodies. So you have to build a sort of, there's the boss and there's a second level, and maybe the third level you'd be in contact with on a somewhat regular basis, right? So you have to have the Japanese people in that first and second level, but the ones that trust you and you trust them, right? You just can't run lots and lots of people and trust everybody. I mean, because it's just too many people to. So they have to, build their own trust levels beneath you, right? It's probably the way to do it, I think. Right? I mean, one of the things I like to do is I do a lot of walking around. I don't have a private office. Sit out there with the troops, with everybody else, and wander in. Right now, for example, these days with COVID, where a lot of people working from home, they're not coming to the office very much at all, which is fine, as long as the business gets done. But I make a point of coming in once or twice a week just to see if anybody's there and pat them on the shoulder, and, gokuro-san, So, you just got to, it's pretty basic. I mean, there's no magic science in this, I don't think.
But how about when they are in the office? So, I mean, this is COVID times. The last couple of years have been quite exceptional, hasn't it? People working from home, we've never really seen that before for most industries. Some industries perhaps, but most industries no. Certainly I've never had that experience until this occasion. So in that sort of normal times when people are around, so you were using the sort of management by walking around, Tom Peters and,
Well, I don't know whether it's him or anybody. I mean, it's just sort of natural.
Yeah. And what about in terms of your direct reports? How about building trust with your direct reports, particularly when, you came into the business and then it got bought out and you sort of stayed on and then got bought out again, I guess, and stayed on.
Yeah.
So you've sort of morphed through different owners.
Right.
And I guess there's a fair bit of transition going on there for the team.
Right.
How did you work to maintain the trust with the team through these transitions?
Well, what you have to explain to them is that our business is a service business, right? We're doing research, we're providing reports and so on. It's not a manufacturing business. So when you do mergers and acquisitions, the first thing you're looking for is, okay, we want greater scale, but we're also trying to cut costs by closing 2 factories or doing this or merging this and this and this. I just had to explain to everybody, having been through so many of these, that was also rather important. So when you're on the being bought side, that's where the nervousness is, rather than if you're the buyer, right? But as I explained to them, we sat them down in the room and said, look, why do you think they're buying you? Right? They're not buying us to cut costs, right? Because the business goes down in the elevator at 5 o'clock every night, right? I mean, maybe 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, depending on the people. But you're not buying into the service business to reduce costs. There's no reason to buy into the company, right? It's a ridiculous way to run a business. If you're buying our manufacturing, that's a completely different business. But our business, and you explain that to them, and they, okay, still a bit scared, but yeah, okay, that sort of makes sense, right? And so that's, and I've said, I've been through this now, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 times. So don't worry, we'll get there. And we did, we get there.
And what about culture build? Because every organisation is trying to create a certain type of culture in the system, and it could be particularly if you've got multinational companies where there's a certain headquarter culture, and then there'll be an American branch culture or a European branch culture underneath that headquarter culture, and then you get to Japan, and then, what sort of culture you're going to have in Japan for that organisation. You've been through that process, I guess, for building the Japanese version of the corporate culture here. What have you found works in that regard? Because I doubt you can just bring the headquarter culture and just plonk it down in Japan and say, okay, everyone correspond to this. I can't see how that's going to work in many occasions.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a couple of things. Let me reverse a little bit from the headquarters side, right? What does headquarters bring to Japan? Maybe that's one way to look at this, right? And if you're sort of, a sizable Western corporate company, and the president flies in, right, and he takes over as the boss for 3 to 5 years, what does he bring? He brings 2 things, right? 2 things only. Right? I'm assuming he doesn't speak Japanese, which is pretty normal, right? He brings connections to head office and the ability to talk directly to head office in quite direct language, which is, whereas if you're Japanese, it's very difficult to do that. Right? So that's one key job of the shacho, right? The second is to say, look, I know Japan is different, and it probably may not work, but in Argentina in 19-something or other, when I was running Argentina, we tried this, worked pretty well, may not be exact fit for Japan, but, why don't you give it a run? Huh? So the point is that you're bringing a different perspective based on real-world experience, which may or may not play in Japan, but you can at least get people to say, okay, well, I'll give it a run, right? And if you can do both of those things, one is then you can connect with head office as the president and speak very frankly, and secondly, you can then convince the Japanese that there is maybe a way to do it a little differently. It may not be perfect, may not be from an American example, it might be from a French example or a Thai example, or whatever. You can find some parallels and similarities, right? And you have to, modify a bit for Japan, but you can begin to create a different mindset, right?
It's not very easy, though, is it, in Japan? Because any materials you ever want to use in Japan, and we have this because we have these global surveys around particular things to do with, training and mindset and leadership and engagement and blah, right? And I tell them, I say, look, unless we've got a Japanese equivalent of that survey here, I can turn up to a meeting and show them the European results and the Australian results and the American results and the Argentinian results and any results you like. But no one is going to take any notice of that because they'll say, well, where's the Japanese results? Where's the local version of the survey you've done? Because that's the only thing they'll believe. So there's always that hesitancy to accept, well, okay, you did that in France, well, great, but this is Japan. Where's the Japanese survey? Where's the Japanese research? Where's the Japanese equivalent? And until I see that, I'm not sure I'm going to accept anything. That's quite a strong mindset here, I think. So how did you get around that?
Well, I think one of the things, as I mentioned before, is, first of all, we do studies in Japan, right? Mm-hmm. Not that they're not done. I mean, they're done. Then how do you interpret, right? And the Japanese are correct. If you're using a different scale, then to say, you're much worse than the rest of the world doesn't make any sense. No. Right? So a lot of it's to do with language, right? And Japanese is, as we know, a very difficult language. So I think that's part of it. It's not that they're not going to accept it. I mean, and what I was mentioning, let's say I tried this new idea or new concept in whatever it is, some other country, is not a survey. It's based on real-world experience, right? And if you can demonstrate to some extent that there's some similarity, but not 100%, give it a run and see how it goes. That works pretty well, right? I mean, to your other point, I mean, which I think from a different perspective, what you're trying to say is that, maybe not trying to say, what's the right word? There's sometimes a feeling that, we Japanese are a unique, homogeneous race, what works in the rest of the world doesn't work in Japan, etc., etc. That will not fly in a global corporate organization. Because the French say the same thing about themselves. The Thais say the same thing. We are different. Almost every country says they're completely different to the rest of the world. So if you're sitting in head office, whether your head office is in France or in the US or wherever, right, you're already used to that concept, right? So it's not. So what you have to do is, and that's why when we're talking with clients and also even ourselves, reporting to head office, is you have to give some rationale as to why it's different, not just it's different, which then means you need to do some studies or research or provide statistics as to why and this and that happens, right? I mean, a good example is demographics. We now have, last count, 28.7% of the Japanese population over the age of 65. Women more over 30% now because they live longer. So, why aren't people, and advertising agencies only think about young people, right? And they put out katakana. Half the ads are in katakana, right? If you're over 65, you prefer kanji, as an example, right? Do you want to have merito, or do you want to use riten, right, in Japanese, right? The young katakana types love katakana. So, there's an example of age differences which you would not find. Well, first of all, age and language preferences, which you would not necessarily find in America. So you can explain that to people. I mean, there's a logic that you can explain these things. And if you can explain it... Now, the thing is, Japanese are very poor at explaining this. It's sort of normal, right? And they don't really know how to explain. So I spend one of my biggest jobs I do is spending my life explaining Japan to the West and explaining the West to Japan, right? And you're sort of very much in the middle, right? But because you can look on both sides. Now, we have a lot of young ones coming through, who father or mother was foreign, and they're bilingual, bicultural. There's a lot of them coming through now, right? So they're now taking over that sort of role, doing quite a lot of that stuff, right? But, the Japanese are not good at explaining Japan. Just by saying doesn't work in Japan is not going to be acceptable. You have to provide reasons, statistics if possible, or market research, as you say. Right? But, the other thing is you've got to be very careful. Lessons learned over the years. I did some of the first research for Atari.
For which one?
Atari.
Atari, okay, yeah.
You remember Atari?
Atari, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we had these mothers saying, we would never let our children play with video games. Right?
They're supposed to be studying.
Yeah, exactly, And so, and of course, where are we now? McDonald's, we did some of the first research for McDonald's. We Japanese, we don't eat in the street. Okay? And, the biggest store in the world in Ginza was in Ginza for many years. The number one selling store in the world was in Ginza, right? So you have to be a little careful about saying it won't work or it will work. This is not just in Japan, but anywhere, actually, because what we find, when you're looking, when we develop archetypes of new products, right? So that this is sort of just an incremental difference, or this is more of a breakthrough product, or this is one that may be too expensive but good, or it's too early, or whatever, And so the more you go towards breakthrough products, the tougher it is for most people to believe. I mean, Jobs is a classic example with Apple, right? I mean, he didn't believe in market research at all. I'm doing it this way and that's it. So when you have these really big changing type products, right, market research is not, it's good, but, people just take a while to get accustomed to something brand new. Or the internet has radically changed things, right?
And you've given some hints here for people being sent out to Japan by their companies on how to run the operation here.
Yeah.
They probably don't know Japan, don't speak Japanese. You've given some advice. What would be some other advice you'd give people who are going to be sent here to run the corporate operation in Japan?
Well, one is language.
Should they learn Japanese?
It's impossible.
They shouldn't even try.
No, not saying that. The way I explain it to people like that is, look, the Japanese are still learning how to read and write their own language with kanji, at least until middle school, when they're 15, and even when you want more complicated kanji, through high school. So these are native speakers of the language. You're being sent here in a high-level position to run this business, and you've got a wife and family and everything else. So you cannot expect to master the Japanese language in the 3 years you're here, while also fulfilling your other duties, which is to, run the business, make money, do the things we talked about, keep head office happy, etc., etc. So what I suggest them is, you should learn enough just to show people that you're making an effort. And then the thing is, you should then do it in the morning. If you're coming into the office, assuming you come into the office every day, you should do it at 8 o'clock in the morning or 7 in the morning and finish by 8:39, right? Because at the end of the day, when you think you're going to do it, your brain is so tired, you've got all these older obligations, you've got to go out drinking or whatever else.
Calls to America or
yeah,
Europe.
And so you have to, the only way to do it while your brain is fresh is to, in 8 o'clock or whatever time in the morning you get up, right? And you'll pick up enough to be able to, communicate a little bit. And the Japanese appreciate the fact, oh, okay, our boss, he's really making the effort, right? But, should not expect to be able to fluent in Japanese, because the Japanese are still learning how to do it as native speakers, right? Right?
What other advice would you give people who are going to be sent here?
Well, I think, as I said, those are the key things I mentioned. So, a language, right? I mean, the other is your key job is to communicate with head office, in a direct fashion. And because you do have the connections, right? Because you've been in the company 30 years, most people who are being sent here have already done some other post somewhere else, whether it's Argentina or Thailand or China or whatever. They're very experienced, very knowledgeable about the industry they're working in. And so they do bring a lot of benefit to the potential business in Japan, right? And then, as I mentioned, also need to be able to bring these suggestions to how we could improve the scenario in Japan via mentioning of some of their other experiences. Because if you're talking about an experience somewhere else, it may not be Japan, but, and you listen to the Japanese side and say, okay, well, maybe, we could do this and that. I mean, so that's one thing. I mean, one other thing which is maybe more personal is if you don't speak the language and you really want to know what's going on, so you need to have a bilingual assistant who will sit in the meetings with you and sort of whisper in your ear, particularly in meetings of 10 or 12 of top people in the company, right? So that you're familiar with what's going on, right? And what you find is over time, because you're talking about a certain technical area many times, the same words keep repeating. And so what then happens is that you, as the Westerner who doesn't really speak really good Japanese, but you start to, you say, oh, and you throw a couple of words in, and they, he really understands more than he lets us know, right? So, and that's good, because it shows that, you're on top of the business, let people understand you're working hard with the language. It should be a girl, not a boy.
It should be.
It should be a girl who is the assistant, because the girl is less of a threat to usually the senior management tend to be all male. Mm-hmm. And if you have a male who's doing this, then he has the ear of the shacho, and could be perceived as stopping other people from getting things spoken to the shacho properly, or stopping someone else's advancement, or getting his advancement over everybody else. Whereas, if it's just a 22-year-old girl who's got good language, she's not a threat to the senior male Japanese in their 40s and 50s, right? Mm-hmm. Shouldn't be saying that probably, but that's
a reality.
Yeah, it's a reality, right?
It's a reality. Whether it's good or bad is another question.
But, over time, that girl may eventually rise up the ranks as well, but at least early on, and so that's an important, I think, so you can actually get to understand what's going on in real time, as opposed to waiting for it being reported to you. Right? Now, you don't have the time to sit through every meeting, obviously, right? And of course, in Japan, many things are decided long before the meeting's held, and the meeting just decides to have the next meeting. Right?
Yeah. Right. The formalisation of what's already been discussed prior. Yeah. And then the Iwashi's been done, and groundwork's been done, and we formalise that decision. We move on for the next bracket. So what would be your definition of leadership? Bill, how would you define leadership?
I don't have a definition of leadership. I mean, I just always been a leader. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I was captain of this team, captain of that team. It just happens. I mean, there's no there's no definition. I've never gone out and thought about, a definition of this, a definition of that. It just happens.
So you think that it's a sort of self-selection process, you think, for becoming a leader?
I don't know whether it's self-selection. I mean, you don't become a leader by self-selecting yourself. You become a leader because other people ask you or appoint you to be the leader, right? So it's not a self-selection process, right?
So your peers or your...
Well, your peers or some other corporation who, buys you and brings you in or whatever else. It's because they assume you're going to be able to do something, right, to help, And, if you're not delivering, then clearly you're not going to be there very long.
Yeah, right? Your leadership career could be rather truncated.
Yeah, but I've never gone around thinking about definitions of this or definitions of that, right?
Not required. But
not required. Not so much not required. It just never occurred to me to create a definition.
Well, I mean, there's millions of them. There's millions of definitions, so I just wonder if you have them. But that's okay. That's not an issue. Well, Bill, thank you very much. It's been great to chat with you about leading in Japan and hear experiences. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of benefit to people because you've been here a very long time. How many years altogether now in Japan?
Well, I came in 1969 as a student. I watched Mr. Armstrong land on the moon.
Right.
In Japan. So that gives you a bit of a hint.
A bit of a hint, yeah. A substantial number of years. Let's say with that. Okay. Well, thank you, Bill. So please join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.